What would you discover if you could witness your own funeral while still breathing? Robert Williams, billionaire, patriarch, king of his empire, sat in his mahogany study overlooking the sprawling grounds of his Connecticut estate, staring at a family photograph that seemed to mock him with its frozen smiles. The golden frame caught the dying light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across his weathered face. At 73, he had everything money could buy. Mansions dotting the East Coast, a fleet of luxury cars, hotels that bore his name, and Williams Industries, a company that had grown from a small construction firm into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. But tonight, surrounded by the trappings of success, Robert felt utterly alone. The marble floors echoed with emptiness. The crystal chandeliers illuminated nothing but silence, and the Persian rugs couldn't cushion the weight of a question that had been haunting him for months. Who among his family truly loved him? Not his money, not his power, not his legacy, but him. The man beneath the fortune, the father behind the empire. As he traced the faces in the photograph with a trembling finger, Robert Williams made a decision that would shatter his world and reveal the true hearts of those closest to him. Sometimes, the most elaborate lies are born from the deepest truths. The next morning, Robert's private study became a war room for deception. His trusted attorney, Marcus Thompson, sharp-eyed man who had handled the Williams family affairs for 2 decades, sat across from him, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he absorbed the audacious plan. "You want to fake your own terminal illness?" Marcus repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The leather chair creaked as he leaned back, processing the magnitude of what his client was proposing. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Robert's longtime physician and family friend, stood by the fireplace, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hands. Her usually composed demeanor showed cracks of concern. "Robert, you're asking me to lie to your family about cancer, about a 6-month prognosis." But as she watched the desperate hope in his eyes, the same eyes that had built an empire from nothing, she understood. This wasn't about money or power. This was about love. Raw, unfiltered, unconditional love. The kind that couldn't be bought or inherited. "I'll need to make it convincing," she said finally, her voice heavy with the weight of the conspiracy they were about to unleash. The stage was set, the players in position, but who would prove to be the hero and who the villain? The transformation began at dawn. Robert Williams, who had once commanded boardrooms with his booming voice and commanding presence, now lay in his king-size bed, his face pale with carefully applied makeup, his breathing labored with practiced precision. The silk sheets seemed to swallow his deliberately weakened frame as he perfected the art of appearing dying. Every cough was calculated, every tremor rehearsed, every moment of weakness a masterpiece of deception. When Margaret, his wife of 35 years, entered their bedroom with her morning coffee, she found a man she barely recognized. Gone was the titan of industry who had swept her off her feet at a charity gala decades ago. In his place lay a fragile shell, and her perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat in shock. "Robert, darling, what's wrong?" The coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor like the first crack in their carefully constructed world. Therefore, children, Michael, the ambitious eldest; David, the smooth-talking second son; Catherine, the social media queen; and Rose, the quiet youngest, would soon discover that their father's illness would become a mirror, reflecting not his mortality, but their own moral character. Truth has a way of revealing itself, even when wrapped in lies. Dr. Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as she placed her stethoscope back in her bag, the weight of the performance heavy on her shoulders. The Williams family had gathered in the master bedroom like vultures circling prey, their faces a mixture of concern and barely concealed calculation. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting dramatic shadows across the scene as she prepared to deliver the news that would set everything in motion. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice catching with genuine emotion despite the fabricated nature of her words. "Your father has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Extensive." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the tick of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Margaret's face went ashen, her hand gripping the bedpost for support. Rose, barely 25, and the baby of the family let out a strangled sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. But it was Michael's reaction that caught Robert's attention, the way his eldest son's eyes flickered briefly to the family portrait on the nightstand, then to his father's face, calculating, measuring, already planning. The test had begun. In the theater of grief. Some are better actors than others. The first week passed in a blur of forced sympathy and manufactured concern. The Williams mansion, once filled with the sounds of laughter and life, now echoed with hushed whispers and carefully orchestrated displays of devotion. Margaret flitted between rooms like a ghost, her designer clothes hanging loose on her frame. As she struggled to process the news, Michael had taken indefinite leave from his position at a prestigious law firm, claiming he needed to be there for family, while David canceled his European business trip with theatrical reluctance. But Robert, lying in his bed with the patience of a seasoned hunter, began to notice the subtle changes. How Margaret's visits became shorter each day, how her touches grew more perfunctory, how she seemed to flinch when he reached for her hand, how Michael's phone calls grew more frequent, his voice carrying through the walls as he spoke in hushed tones about preparing for the transition, how Catherine posted carefully curated photos of herself looking sorrowful, hashtags about family and strength garnering thousands of likes. Only Rose remained constant, her small hand always finding his, her voice soft and unwavering. "I'm here, Daddy, I'm not going anywhere." When the shepherd lies down, the wolves reveal their true nature. 2 weeks into the charade, Michael made his first bold move. He strode into Robert's study, a sacred space, where billion-dollar deals had been forged in empires, built carrying a leather portfolio that seemed to pulse with ambition. His father watched from the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe that emphasized his supposed frailty, as his eldest son settled into the chair behind the massive oak desk with disturbing ease. "Dad, I think it's time we discuss the company," Michael said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone who had been practicing this conversation. "You need to focus on your health, on getting better. Let me handle Williams Industries." The words hung in the air like poison, each syllable carefully chosen to sound reasonable, caring, responsible. But Robert saw the hunger in his son's eyes. The way his fingers drummed against the desk with barely contained excitement. The same desk where Robert had worked 18-hour days, where he had built something from nothing, where he had sacrificed everything for his family's future. Now that very family was preparing to carve up his life's work before he was even gone. Power corrupts, but the promise of power corrupts even faster. With his father's reluctant blessing, Michael transformed overnight from dutiful son to corporate raider. The Williams Industries headquarters buzzed with gossip as he swept through the building like a conquering general, his expensive suits and newly acquired swagger announcing his presence before he even entered a room. The company's financial reports became his daily obsession, not for their health, but for their potential. Within days, Michael had authorized the company's first ever morale-boosting party, a lavish affair that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Crystal champagne flowed like water. Gourmet catering filled conference rooms. And Michael basked in the attention like a king at his coronation. He purchased a cherry red Tesla Model S, telling anyone who would listen that it was for company efficiency, while planning a vacation to Monaco that would make tabloid editors weep with envy. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Robert watched his life's work being dismantled with surgical precision. Each frivolous expense, a knife thrust into his own. The true measure of a man's character is how he treats those who can do nothing for him. The purge began on a Tuesday morning that would live in Williams Industries' infamy. Michael arrived at the office early, his face set in grim determination as he prepared to reshape the company in his own image. The longtime employees, men and women, who had worked alongside Robert for decades, who had helped build the empire from the ground up, suddenly found themselves called into human resources, one by one. Mr. Peterson, the 60-year-old head of operations who had been with the company since its early days, emerged from his meeting with tears in his eyes and a cardboard box in his hands. 32 years, he whispered to his secretary. 32 years. And he said I was incompatible with the new vision. The scene repeated itself throughout the day. loyal employees, dedicated workers, institutional knowledge, walking out the door in favor of Michael's college friends, and networking contacts, people who knew stock options but not sacrifice, who understood profit margins but not the pride of building something lasting. Robert, watching from his supposed deathbed, felt each termination like a physical blow to his chest. Blood may be thicker than water, but greed is thicker than blood. The explosion came without warning, erupting in the Williams Industries boardroom like a corporate volcano. David, his face flushed with rage and his usually perfect hair disheveled, stormed into the glass-walled conference room where Michael was holding court with his new team of sycophants. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the floor like a gunshot, causing several employees to look up from their desks in alarm. "Have you lost your mind?" David shouted, his voice carrying the raw emotion of a man watching his inheritance evaporate. "You're destroying everything Dad built. These people aren't qualified to run a lemonade stand, let alone a billion-dollar company." Michael's response was cold, calculated, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Dad chose me, David, not you, me. And I'm making the necessary changes to ensure this company thrives in the modern world." The physical confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. Two brothers, raised in privilege and comfort, throwing punches like street fighters while security guards rushed to separate them. The sight of his son's blood on the marble floor was something Robert would never forget, even if he lived to be 100. Sometimes the youngest voice carries the most wisdom. Rose found them in the study that evening, her brothers nursing their wounds and their pride in equal measure. At 25, she possessed a quiet strength that had always set her apart from her siblings. No social media empire like Catherine, no corporate ambition like Michael, no smooth charisma like David, just a deep well of empathy that seemed to run straight to her soul. "Look at yourselves," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. "Daddy is upstairs, sick and scared, and you're down here fighting over money like animals." Her eyes, red from crying, moved between her brothers with a mixture of disappointment and heartbreak. "He gave us everything. Private schools, college educations, trust funds, opportunities that most people can only dream of. And this is how you repay him, by tearing apart his life's work before he's even gone." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of their father's manufactured coughing from upstairs. Neither brother could meet her eyes, their shame hanging in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Justice has a way of keeping score, even when the game seems rigged. Marcus Thompson arrived at the Williams mansion that evening like a harbinger of doom, his usually pristine appearance showing signs of strain. His silver hair was disheveled, his tie loosened, and his briefcase clutched in his hands like a shield against the chaos he'd witnessed. He'd built his reputation on discretion and professionalism, but what he'd seen at Williams Industries had shaken him to his core. "Your sons are destroying everything you've built," he told Robert bluntly, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of legal experience. "Michael's reckless spending and mass firings have spooked the investors. The board of directors is asking questions. And David," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "David sold the Grandview Hotel this morning, for cash, below market value." Robert felt his carefully constructed facade crack, for just a moment, his eyes blazing with real anger at the news. The Grandview had been his first major acquisition, the jewel in his crown, the property that had launched his empire. Now it was gone, sold by his own son like a trinket at a yard sale. The test was revealing truths he wasn't sure he was prepared to face. Love is a choice made new each day, and some choose to stop choosing. Margaret Williams stood in the doorway of her husband's bedroom, her perfectly coiffed hair catching the morning light streaming through the windows, but there was something different about her today, a coldness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a distance in her posture that spoke of decisions made in the dark hours of the night. The woman who had once promised to love him in sickness and in health now looked at him like he was already a corpse. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "The smell, the dying, it's too much." She turned away from him, unable or unwilling to meet his eyes. "I'm going to stay in the guest house until it's over." The words hit Robert like physical blows. each syllable a betrayal that cut deeper than any business loss or financial setback. This was the woman he had built his empire for, the mother of his children, the partner of his heart. And now, in his hour of supposed need, she was walking away. The sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor as she left echoed in his ears like a funeral march. In the ecology of greed, there are always scavengers waiting to feed. Catherine Williams, Instagram influencer, social media darling, and the most image-conscious of the Williams children, saw her father's illness as an opportunity wrapped in tragedy. Her carefully curated posts about family strength and cherishing every moment garnered thousands of likes and comments, her follower count climbing as she monetized her grief with surgical precision. But behind the camera, away from the ring, lights, and perfectly staged shots, Catherine was busy converting her supposed sorrow into cold, hard cash. The designer shopping sprees began subtly. New handbag here, a luxury watch. They were all charged to the family accounts with the justification that she needed to look strong for the family. But as the weeks passed, the purchases became more brazen. A complete wardrobe overhaul, a new car, a down payment on a penthouse apartment in Manhattan. I need to secure my future, she told herself, even as she posed for another tearful selfie outside her father's bedroom door. The hashtag family first had never felt more hypocritical. Each post a small betrayal wrapped in designer clothing and filtered lighting. In a world of wolves, sometimes the smallest sheep shows the greatest courage. While her family circled like vultures, Rose Williams remained a constant presence at her father's bedside. She had quit her job at the nonprofit foundation work that had fulfilled her soul, but barely paid her bills to become his full-time caregiver. Her days began before dawn, checking his medications, adjusting his pillows, and holding his hand through the manufactured pain that seemed so real it had become real to her. She read to him from his favorite books, played his cherished jazz records, and told him stories about her childhood that made his eyes shine with genuine warmth. When he couldn't sleep, she would sit in the chair beside his bed, her hand resting on his, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his supposed illness. "I'm not going anywhere, Daddy," she whispered one night, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "Whatever happens, I'll be right here." And in that moment, Robert Williams, billionaire, patriarch, master of deception, felt his heart break not from grief, but from the overwhelming love of a daughter who had chosen to stay when everyone else had chosen to leave. The line between acting and reality blurs when the performance becomes your life. Dr. Mitchell arrived for her weekly examination with the weight of the deception heavy on her shoulders. The fake medical reports, the manufactured symptoms, the carefully orchestrated decline, it was all becoming too real, too painful to maintain. She watched Rose's face as she delivered another grim prognosis, saw the genuine terror in the young woman's eyes, and felt her professional oath warring with her personal loyalty to Robert. "The cancer is progressing faster than we hoped," she heard herself saying, the lies tasting like ash in her mouth. "We need to consider making him comfortable." Rose's strangled sob echoed through the room, and Dr. Mitchell had to excuse herself to the bathroom, where she splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, co-conspirator in an elaborate fraud that was causing real pain to innocent people. But she had given her word, and she would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. Nothing brings out the worst in people like the promise of money. The news of Robert's deteriorating condition spread through their social circles like wildfire, and suddenly the Williams mansion was filled with visitors who had been notably absent during healthier times. Distant relatives emerged from the woodwork, their faces masks of concern that barely concealed their calculating eyes. Business associates who had been ignoring his calls suddenly found time for friendly visits that always seemed to steer toward discussions of the future. Margaret's sister, who hadn't spoken to the family in 5 years, arrived with flowers and a casserole, her gaze sweeping over the expensive artwork and antique furniture with the practiced eye of an appraiser. "We should talk about the arrangements," she whispered to Margaret in the hallway, her voice carrying the excited undertones of someone who smelled opportunity in the air. Even the household staff seemed different, more attentive, more eager to please, as if positioning themselves for the inevitable changes that would come with new ownership. Robert, observing it all from his supposed deathbed, felt like he was watching his own funeral in real. Every performance has its limits. Every actor their breaking point. The weight of the deception was beginning to crush Robert's spirit. What had started as a test of love had become a masterclass in human greed and selfishness. He lay in his bed, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that had once brought him pride, now feeling like a king in a kingdom of betrayers. The manufactured coughing fits had become real from the stress. The fake weakness had seeped into his bones like poison, and the pretend dying had begun to feel like actual death. But it was the sound of laughter from downstairs that finally shattered his composure. Michael was throwing another party, a celebration of life, he called it, as if his father were already gone. The music pounded through the floorboards. Champagne corks popped like gunshots, and voices raised in toast after toast to the great man who lay supposedly dying 3 floors above them. Robert pressed his face into his pillow and wept not the crocodile tears of his performance, but the genuine sobs of a man who had discovered that the family he'd built was nothing more than a house of cards, ready to collapse at the first strong wind. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to disappear. Rose found him that night, staring out the window at the manicured gardens that had once been his pride and joy. The moonlight cast everything in silver, making the familiar landscape look foreign and cold. "Daddy," she whispered, settling into the chair beside his bed, "I can't watch you suffer like this anymore. I've been thinking, maybe we should take you away from here, somewhere peaceful, somewhere you can rest." The idea hit Robert like a revelation. Away from the mansion, away from the vultures, away from the performance that was killing him more surely than any cancer. "Where would we go?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Rose's face lit up with hope for the first time in weeks. "Remember, when I was little, and you used to tell me stories about the house where you grew up, about your grandmother's farm upstate. Maybe we could find a place like that, somewhere quiet, somewhere we could have some peace." And in that moment, Robert Williams, master of industry, captain of empire, decided that perhaps it was time to disappear, to let the dead man rest, while the living man searched for something he'd lost along the way, the simple joy of being loved for who he was, not what he owned. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of an old pickup truck and a daughter's love. They left in the dead of night, like thieves stealing away with the most precious treasure of all time. Rose had borrowed a friend's pickup truck, and she helped her father climb into the passenger seat with the careful tenderness of someone handling fragile glass. The mansion loomed behind them in the darkness, its windows glowing with the artificial light of a family that had forgotten how to love authentically. As they drove through the empty streets of Connecticut, Robert felt a strange sense of liberation. The silk pajamas had been replaced with simple cotton clothes, the Egyptian cotton sheets exchanged for an old quilt that smelled of lavender and memories. "Where are we going?" he asked, though he found he didn't really care as long as Rose was beside him. "A place I found online," she said, her eyes focused on the road ahead. "A small town called Millbrook. They have a bed and breakfast run by an old couple who specializes in helping people find peace." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken hope and the promise of something better than what they were leaving behind. True healing starts not in the body, but in the heart. Millbrook was everything. The Williams mansion was not small, quiet, genuine. The bed and breakfast sat on 5 acres of rolling hills, with a front porch that wrapped around the entire building, and rocking chairs that creaked in the evening breeze. Martha and Henry Sullivan, the elderly couple who ran the place, greeted them with the kind of warmth that money couldn't buy and status couldn't earn. "You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world," Martha observed, her weathered hands gentle as she helped Robert settle into his room. The space was simple but comfortable, handmade quilts, fresh flowers from the garden, and windows that looked out onto fields where horses grazed in the afternoon sun. For the first time in months, Robert slept without pretending to be dying, without calculating his performance, without wondering who was plotting his downfall in the rooms below. When he awoke, Rose was sitting in the chair by his bed, but this time she was smiling. Truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid, and sometimes that's the greatest gift of all. They sat on the porch as the sun set over the rolling hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that no amount of money could purchase. Robert had spent the day walking the property, his strength returning with each step, his spirit healing in the clean country air. But the weight of his deception still pressed on his chest like a stone. "Rose," he said finally, his voice carrying the tremor of a man about to change everything. "I need to tell you something. About the cancer, about the doctors, about everything." She turned to him, her face open and trusting, and he felt his heart break all over again. "I was never sick. There was no cancer. It was all a test, a horrible, necessary test to see who in our family truly loved me." The words tumbled out of him like water from a broken dam, carrying with them months of guilt and sorrow and desperate hope. Rose's face went through a dozen emotions: shock, confusion, anger, hurt before settling on something he didn't expect. "Understanding. You needed to know," she said simply, "and now you do. Love is not blind, it sees everything and chooses to love anyway." The days that followed were a revelation. Without the pretense of illness, without the performance of dying, Robert rediscovered the man he had been before the wealth and power had complicated everything. He helped Henry repair a fence, learned to milk cows, and spent hours talking with Martha about everything and nothing. Rose watched him transform from the desperate, broken man who had fled the mansion to someone she remembered from her childhood, laughing, present, alive. "I'm proud of you," she told him one evening as they sat watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. "Not for the money or the company or any of that. I'm proud of you for having the courage to find out the truth, even when it hurt." Robert reached for her hand, marveling at the simple miracle of unconditional love. "I'm sorry I put you through all of this," he said. "I'm sorry I made you watch me die when all you wanted was to love me while I was living." They sat in comfortable silence, father and daughter, millionaire and caregiver, both of them finally understanding that the greatest wealth was the every hero's journey must end where it began. But the hero is never the same. The call came from Marcus Thompson on a Tuesday morning that dawned bright and clear. "Robert, you need to come back." The lawyer's voice was tight with urgency. "The company is hemorrhaging money. Michael's decisions have spooked the major investors. David's sold 3 more properties, and Margaret—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Margaret has filed for divorce. She's claiming you abandoned the family." Robert looked out at the peaceful hills, at Rose tending Martha's garden, at the simple life they had built in just a few short weeks. Part of him wanted to stay, to let Robert Williams, the billionaire, die in truth, while Robert Williams, the man, lived on in quiet anonymity. But he had responsibilities, a legacy to protect, and a family, however flawed, that needed to learn the consequences of their choices. "We'll be back tonight," he said simply. "It's time to finish what we started. Sometimes the dead must rise to judge the living." The mansion looked different when they returned, smaller, somehow, despite its grand proportions. The gardens were overgrown, the windows seemed dimmer, and the very air felt heavy with tension and guilt. As their car pulled into the circular driveway, Robert could see faces appearing at windows, shocked, disbelieving, afraid. Michael was the first to reach them, stumbling out of the house in his pajamas, his face white with shock. "Dad, Dad, you're walking, you're okay." The doctors said. He stopped, his mind clearly struggling to process the impossibility of what he was seeing. Catherine and David appeared moments later, their faces mirrors of confusion and dawning realization. But it was Margaret who provided the most dramatic reaction, fainting dead away on the marble steps when she saw her supposedly terminal husband climbing out of the car with steady, healthy steps. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It is justice with compound interest. The family gathered in the living room like defendants awaiting sentencing, their faces a mixture of shame, confusion, and barely contained panic. Robert stood before them, no longer the weak, dying man they had known, but the powerful patriarch who had built an empire with his bare hands. The transformation was complete from vulnerable victim to final judge. "I was never sick," he began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "There was no cancer, no 6-month prognosis, no impending death. It was all a test to see who among you truly loved me and who was simply waiting for me to die so you could claim your inheritance." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Margaret's sharp intake of breath and Catherine's whispered, "Oh my God." Michael's face went from white to red to white again, while David simply stared at his father with the expression of a man watching his world collapse in the court of family. "There are no appeals, only consequences." Robert moved through the room like an avenging angel, his words cutting through the air with surgical precision. "Michael, you destroyed 40 years of relationships in 40 days. You fired loyal employees, spent company money like water, and nearly bankrupted the business I built with my blood and sweat. You are hereby removed from all positions in Williams Industries. Security will escort you out tomorrow morning." He turned to David, whose face had gone ashen. "You sold my properties, my hotel, my land, pieces of my soul like they were garage sale items. What you didn't know is that Marcus bought them all back through shell companies. The money you thought you made, it was mine all along. Consider it the cost of your education in betrayal." David's legs gave out, and he collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. Catherine tried to make herself invisible, but Robert's gaze found her anyway. "And you, my dear daughter, turned my illness into a social media spectacle. You'll find your trust fund frozen as of this morning. The deepest cuts come from those who promise to love you forever." Robert saved his wife for last, the woman who had stood beside him for 35 years, who had worn his ring and borne his children and promised to love him in sickness and in health. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she realized that her husband had witnessed her ultimate betrayal, not just the abandonment, but the young man she had been secretly seeing, the divorce papers she had filed, the assets she had tried to hide. "You left me," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of 3 decades of marriage. "When you thought I was dying, you left me. You brought another man into our home, into our bed, while I lay supposedly dying upstairs. You filed for divorce papers while I was supposedly on my deathbed." Margaret tried to speak, but Robert held up a hand. "I loved you completely, Margaret. I gave you everything I had to give, and in return, you gave me the knowledge that I was already dead to you, long before I pretended to be." The words hung in the air like a funeral shroud, final and absolute. Sometimes the smallest voice speaks the loudest truth in the devastation that followed. One figure stood apart from the recadros, who had loved without condition, who had stayed without question, who had chosen devotion over dollars at every turn. Robert turned to her with eyes that held both pride and profound sadness, seeing in her the reflection of the man he had once been, before power and wealth had corrupted his vision. "Rose," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would reshape the entire family's future. "You are the only one who passed the test. The only one who chose love over money, loyalty over opportunity, sacrifice over Therefore, you inherit everything: the company, the properties, the trust funds, all of it. You are now the sole heir to the Williams fortune." The room erupted in shocked gasps and desperate protests. But Robert's word was law, and Marcus Thompson was already there with the legal documents that would make it binding. Every ending is also a beginning, and every fall makes room for someone to rise. 6 months later, Williams Industries was thriving under Rose's leadership. The loyal employees had been rehired, the reckless spending had been curtailed, and the company's stock price had soared to record highs. Rose, who had once worked for a non-profit for barely enough to pay her bills, now commanded a billion-dollar empire with the same quiet strength she had shown at her father's bedside. Michael worked as a junior associate at a small law firm, his arrogance replaced by hard-won humility. David had taken a job selling real estate, learning the value of property from the ground up. Catherine had deleted her social media accounts and enrolled in community college, trying to build a life based on substance rather than appearances. And Margaret, she had disappeared entirely, her young lover having abandoned her when he realized there would be no inheritance windfall. Love is the only inheritance that grows when you give it away. Robert Williams sat in his study, no longer the desperate man who had once stared at a family photograph and wondered who truly loved him. He had his answer now, written in the ledger of loyalty and paid for with the currency of truth. Rose had proven that sometimes the greatest wealth is measured not in dollars, but in the depth of one's character. The family photographs on his desk had been replaced with new ones, pictures of Rose at company meetings, of former employees, celebrating their return, of the charitable foundation Rose had established in her mother's memory. The mansion still stood, but it no longer felt like a monument to wealth. It felt like a home. And in the quiet moments before sleep, Robert Williams' father, billionaire, survivor of his own test, could finally rest, knowing that his greatest creation wasn't a business empire or a financial legacy, but a daughter who had chosen love. When love was all that mattered, the test was over. Love had won. The end, sometimes the most valuable inheritance we can leave our children is the knowledge of their own character. Sometimes the only way to give them that gift is to let them choose who they want to be when they think